I'm Doug Eakley. I chair the Board of Trustees of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, and I am so happy to see you all here with us to celebrate the kickoff of our 20th anniversary year. I do want to acknowledge a few people, if you'll permit me. The current trustees are listed in the program. If the current trustees could just stand and be recognized, if not individually acknowledged. Then we have past board trustees who are listed on the program, and for those, could those of you who are past board trustees please stand up, among others. So Richard Roper is a doubleheader. He was a founding trustee, and he also took over as acting executive director of the Institute when we lost Ken Zimmerman to Governor. What was his name? Ken? We also should recognize Jerry Harris, who's still a current trustee, but also when we had the misfortune of losing Cornell Brooks, Jerry stepped in and again served as acting executive director. Jerry? I want to recognize Jimmy Schwartz, who's here tonight, and Peter Shapiro, who could not be. But Jimmy and Peter have served as consultants to our finance committee from the beginning. So for a solid 20 years, they have been advising the Institute and its development committee, or finance committee chaired by John Lowenstein, on how best to manage our financial affairs, and we have done very well thanks to them. We have a number of early on staffers who should at least be mentioned, although I don't think any of them are here, but Nancy Fishman, Kelly Doherty, Al Williams, and Craig Levine. But we do have a number of wonderful former staff members who are here, and if they could all just stand and be acknowledged as well, just to say a word of thanks to all of you for all that you've done. So I want to ask John Lowenstein now to come to the rostrum. John, of course, is the son of Alan and Amy Lowenstein. He was a founding trustee. He's a professor of physics at New York University, and it's great to have him with us tonight. John.
Thanks, Doug, and good evening, everybody. I feel particularly honored to be asked to share some of my recollections and perceptions about the Institute. I was one of the founding board members going back to the end of the last century. And it's been 20 years. Perhaps this is a good argument for term limits. I don't know. But I've been fortunate enough to have the permission of the board to remain over this time. And it's been a really satisfying and often inspirational experience. So I'm really very appreciative of that. I'm happy to share some of the ideas that I've had, and I have a very short time, so I'm just going to concentrate on what I consider the core modus operandi of the Institute over the 20-year period, which has been really quite consistent and leading to a great deal of accomplishments and success. And I could go on and on about the many virtues of the organization and of the accomplishments, but I am going to concentrate on this, basically what I consider the core strength of the Institute. Social injustice, unfortunately, is not rare in our state or in our country. And this is why the name of the organization, the words "for social justice" in the name, resonate today just as much as they did 20 years ago. I remember there were, at some point, some people thought, well, maybe it's a little too lefty. We should change the name so we can get some Republicans on the board. Well, anyway, we actually do have a Republican on the board, but he's firmly committed to social justice, so that's the important thing. At any rate, as I said, social injustice abounds, but it's not easy to find what the Institute should do with its limited size. It's getting bigger fast, of course, but it hasn't been all that big compared to some other nonprofits, and it has had limited resources, and the question of how you invest those resources to get some real impact in combating social injustice is a real problem. And I have to say that it's really impressive how our three CEOs / presidents / heroic leaders have dealt with this problem and brilliantly come up with projects which have really met the opportunities which have presented themselves in a very nimble way, and this has been really crucial to the history of the Institute. Now, let me just point out, I'm going to talk about a few examples. I don't have time for many, but I think I'd like to go back to the very beginning, I think, when Ken Zimmerman was leading the institution, and just point out, I mean, I would think that and I'm talking about the ECCC project, the pre-apprenticeship training program that was developed. And this was really, in some sense, an alignment of the stars, for one thing, but also a brilliant perception, I think, on the part of Ken and the staff and others he probably talked about it with, because they realized, A, there was a large sum of money that was being made available for school construction, court mandated. Okay, this meant that there was a big chance for the construction industry in Essex County to suddenly gear up for building schools, et cetera. And, however, in addition to the companies, they would need a boost in their labor force. That was clear. But the labor unions were languishing. They really would need to add a lot of people to their roles to really take advantage of this. And but there was a stumbling block, right? Namely that the number of people that, before I get to the stumbling block, the opportunity was to get residents of Newark and surrounding cities a chance to enter the construction industry, people who were underrepresented and who had never had a chance because of various impediments, which we don't have to go into, but there was a whole population of people who could benefit from these new jobs who in the past had not been able to enter into the unions. And the stumbling block was that there simply were not that many people who had the minimal qualifications for apprenticeship. And one had to recognize that. The unions were, of course, reluctant to let in lots of people, but certainly not letting in people unless they thought they could benefit from the apprenticeship programs that existed. Okay, so to solve that puzzle, the Institute had this brilliant idea of setting up a pre-apprenticeship program for training people so that they could enter. And this was really, I think, was just absolutely brilliant, and it turned out, under Ken's leadership and Becky Doggett, it turned out to be a real success and a real representation of how a small organization with a correct way of approaching problems, correct and highly focused and intelligent way of approaching problems could actually have real impact in the social justice arena. So the first step of focusing on a project of value is, of course, essential, but it's certainly not the whole story. It required, in addition to that, the application of intelligence and evidence-based analysis, which the Institute has really excelled in over the years, before jumping into some project when one needed to really analyze it, put things into words, perhaps into writing, have plenty of consultation with the board, with colleagues, with both inside and outside of the Institute. And then, of course, all of that would be worthless unless it was followed up with actual action. Ken has always used to say, I mean, maybe he still says it, that the Institute is not simply an excellent think tank, right, where we analyze problems, but it's a think and do tank, right? We analyze them, then we act on them in a way which can help solve the problem. And this has been characteristic of the Institute's modus operandi, not just in that project I mentioned, but in a number that were carried out under our distinguished CEOs over the years, over the full 20 years. I'd say it's a characteristic of the Institute's the way it operates. Now, let's see. Yes. Now, Ryan Haygood has often described the Institute's core goal as breaking down load-bearing walls. Okay, now this is a powerful image, right, which it pictures an edifice of injustice which can be brought tumbling down provided one attacks the structural elements at the base of this edifice. These walls could take the form of, say, laws which have been cleverly engineered to limit opportunity or promote inequality. They may exist in subtler form as culturally ingrained impediments in people's minds. Breaking down such load-bearing walls has been intrinsic to many of the Institute's activities. A notable example of this was the Ban the Box campaign undertaken under Cornell's leadership as part of the Institute's long-term commitment to remove obstacles to employment for persons re-entering society from prison. More recently, we've had an almost literal evocation of the breaking down load-bearing walls theme. The Institute's campaign to get the state to close the Jamesburg and Hayes youth prisons is almost literally breaking down walls. The Institute's meticulous research made clear the wasteful nature of these prisons, both in terms of taxpayer dollars and, more importantly, the human potential of the inmates. This was forcefully conveyed to the governor, actually two governors, and the legislature by all means available and with notable success. Those prison walls, at least figuratively, will come down. Okay. But you know, to me, and this is something I've mentioned to Ryan, breaking down load-bearing walls is really just half of the story. Equally significant are the Institute's mighty efforts in building load-bearing walls. I have in mind supporting walls of both institutional and psychological kind, helping individuals and communities acquire the skills, procedures, and self-confidence to rebuild their lives with resiliency and strength in the face of continuing hardships and temporary setbacks. I think we just have to think, many of us were present at the time that Ryan took over, and I just remember that gala where he gave a really inspirational inaugural talk. But in addition, there was a video made of a woman whose name was Crystal. I don't remember her last name, but it was a testimony to her experience in the workforce development program, training program, and how it had prepared her for entering the construction industry, not just the skills of actually doing something and that was would be employment in the construction industry, but just the psychological strengthening and that it gave her to persevere and actually achieve something in her life which she hadn't imagined before. And that impressed me enormously. And this is, I call this building load-bearing walls, right? I think it's a really nice metaphor that you need to not only inject some skills or confidence or something into people, but you need to do it in a way which is sufficiently broad and deep so that they can actually survive and thrive in a harsh environment, which life for many people is. So I think the prison closing campaign is a good example of this. The Institute is continuing to press for new facilities, new rehabilitative procedures that will properly deal with the state's troubled youth without sacrificing public safety. Building the new load-bearing walls will not be easy, but the struggle continues with the Institute and other organizations in the forefront. I think the policing reform, which the Institute is also deeply involved with in Newark, is another one of these examples where already there's been tremendous progress in actually getting the Newark Police Department to reform its procedures, getting new police into the jobs with a new attitude, and a very impressive training program with training all of the police in a whole set of new policies, very encouraging. And this has broken down load-bearing walls that have separated the police from the Newark community. And it hasn't done that yet completely. In fact, there's a lot of work to do to break down those walls. There really are tough walls. But it will, the hope is it will happen, and it will happen in a way that new load-bearing structures will have been built in the Newark Police Department, which will allow it to have a healthy interplay with the community. And the Institute is going to be there for this, and I hope for years. It's going to take years, but I can see that this is something that we're really well equipped to work with, and we'll do it. Okay, I've used up my time, so let me just finish. Getting back to the main focus of this evening's event, my 2 decades on the Board of Trustees have left me with a firm conviction that the most important, if rarely exercised, function of a board member is the choice of our Chief Executive Officer. I think by the end of the evening you'll be convinced, if you aren't already, that in this respect our board has been eminently successful. Thank you very much for your attention.
So as the program indicates, our moderator for this evening is Elise Boddy. Elise is a trustee of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. She's also a nationally recognized civil rights expert, leader, and advocate. She served for some time as the litigation director of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, where I think she met Ryan Haygood, before joining Rutgers Law School as the Henry Rutgers University professor and Robert L. Carter Scholar. Elise is also the founder and the executive director of the Inclusion Project at Rutgers Law School, which seeks to advance racial inclusion and equality, and a founding trustee of the New Jersey Coalition for Diverse and Inclusive Schools. Elise is the author of some 10 law review articles on such subjects as equal protection, the future of affirmative action and racial integration. I think she's working on an entire book and chapters in 2 other books as we speak, or maybe not tonight, but at least a prodigious scholar and advocate, both combined for a forceful message. Elise is also on the board of the National Board of the American Constitution Society and a member of the American Law Institute. I am delighted to introduce my wonderful friend and our distinguished colleague, Elise Body.
All right, hi everybody. Let's get started. This is going to be fun. So I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing our distinguished panelists, former CEOs and current CEO, and then posing questions to them. And that's the honor part. The challenge is getting them to stay within the boundaries of the assigned time, but we'll work on that. So first, Ken Zimmerman, to the far left of the stage. So Ken was the first executive director of the Institute from 1999 to 2006. He is a fair housing expert, civil rights attorney. I first met Ken when I was an intern in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. He directed the Open Society Foundation's U.S. programs, was a litigation partner in the Pro Bono Group, Lowenstein Sandler, served on the presidential transition team for the Obama administration, and was also chief counsel for Governor Corzine. He's now a distinguished fellow with NYU's Furman Center. So welcome, Ken. Thank you so much for being here. So next, my dear friend, Cornell William Brooks, a civil rights attorney, an ordained minister. Cornell led the Institute from 2007 to 2014. He has been a professor of social ethics, law, and justice movements at Boston University School of Law and School of Theology. He was the director of the campaign, or is the director of the campaign and advocacy program at the Kennedy School's Institute of Politics. He was the senior counsel at the Office of Communications and Business Opportunities at the FCC, and was the 18th president of the NAACP. And Cornell is currently a professor of practice of public leadership and social justice at the Harvard Kennedy School, and is a visiting scholar at Harvard Divinity School. So thank you so much for being here. And last but certainly not least, Ryan P. Haygood, who is the current president and CEO of the Institute. I first met Ryan when he was a law student, so many years ago. We won't comment on the number of years. Ryan leads 20, yeah, all right, well, there, you put it out there, I didn't. He leads the Institute's work to uplift urban communities by focusing on criminal justice reform, economic opportunity, and civic engagement. He is a nationally respected civil rights leader who served as the deputy director of litigation at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, worked for more than a decade on some of the most important civil rights cases of our time, is a frequent commentator and speaker in a number of different media outlets. So Ryan, it's wonderful to be here. All right. So with that, I'd like each of you to start, and we'll just start with Ken and just move on down the line. I'd like to ask you to reflect on your time at the Institute, what led you to the Institute, what were some of your expectations about the work, surprises, challenges? Go to it. Ken
Wonderful.
Zimmerman.
Well, first and foremost, thank you, everybody. It's truly a trip down memory lane for me. But I want to start with my deep thanks to Cornell and Ryan and the board members who are here. Having spent a lot of time with nonprofits in a variety of capacities, I'm always mindful of the old line that vision without a plan is just hallucination. And unfortunately, we live in an age where there's lots of good ideas, lots of visionaries, but vision that doesn't translate to real change in real people's lives doesn't stand up. And it certainly doesn't stand up for 20 years. And so part of what gives me so much hope, part of what gives me actually a level of inspiration is being here today and with deep appreciation to Cornell and Ryan, with my former colleagues, Becky, Rodney, Ellen, and the board members, for not just settling for vision, but being committed to translating it through the hard work of seeing it realized in real people's lives. So thank you. You talked about the challenges one's had. I'm tempted to start with a story some of you have heard, that my greatest challenge was actually surviving my job interview when Alan Lowenstein almost killed me, because at age 85, he insisted, as part of the job interview, of driving me through Newark with John and my wife in the back seat, and actually went, I think at one point, the wrong way down a one-way street, opening up the serious question during a job interview: is seizing the wheel from the founder a good thing or a bad thing? But not only did we survive, but it actually reflects something incredibly important about the origin story of the Institute, which is Alan's deep belief in Newark. Alan tells stories about his grandmother seeing Abraham Lincoln on the courthouse steps, and came from a place where, for his own life and for those of many others in Newark, Newark was a place of assets. Newark was a place of opportunity. Newark was a place, though, where there were structural barriers that prevented it from realizing its full potential. And with that vision, with a man of commitment, of integrity, of real belief in the possibility of creating justice, he created something by making 5 years of funding available, recruiting a remarkable board, and then saying, if the Institute could pass the test of showing it could make a difference, of being willing to endow it. And as somebody who's been in philanthropy, that is a remarkably creative and sophisticated act. And I think its core values, the Institute's core values, actually emanate from who Alan was, from the founding board he put together, and from a vision of what Newark and other urban areas can be for all of its residents. And that is a remarkably exciting thing, and I hope makes clear what drew me from my 10 years of civil rights work in the Clinton administration to come to Newark and participate with the board in moving that forward. So when you talk about other challenges, I remember 20 years ago sitting in Roseland in an office that Doug Eakley, who had succeeded in recruiting me and even more importantly my wife here, made available to me, with a desk that was completely empty, saying, what's next? And really, the premise, as I've indicated from those values, led to an approach, a theory of change, if you will, that had, I think, fairly obvious core elements. I mean, the first was a belief, as John articulated, in being solution-oriented, of saying that if you're going to take on structural challenges, you can't just identify the problem, you have to figure out what you're going to do about it. And so whether it was as an ECCC, doing the analysis, the work on predatory lending, the criminal justice reform efforts, all began with data collection. And I think that not only the data collection, but the engagement of community around it was critical. The second was a deep belief in the importance of independence and credibility. And that came not just from the independence that the funding provided, but actually credibility as broadly defined. Not just credibility with elite audiences, but credibility with community. And that requires a humility to listen to people as a core value, and then to be able to leverage the remarkable assets the Institute has and translate that into action. I think the third that flows from that was a deep belief in the importance and value of collaboration, that there are deep assets in Newark and other places in New Jersey, and that part of what one can do, if one operates in a fashion that begins with listening, but also takes seriously evidence and solution orientation, to building the strength not just of the Institute, but of the surrounding organizations, whether it be private sector, nonprofit sector, or government. And one of the great gifts that Alan gave through that origin story was the ability not to need to take credit. We could actually defer credit onto others who would therefore join us in building out the really complicated coalitions that are needed. And then finally, I think, was a deep belief that there's national expertise that exists, but that ultimately the Institute's value add is an understanding of Newark, New Jersey, so that whatever good ideas exist nationally can be tapped, but they have to be brought to ground in Newark. And so all of that, I think, was the beginning. There were remarkable things I am deeply proud of that were only made available by the remarkable board and staff that existed. Some of them were, the first case in the country that said reverse redlining was a violation of the Fair Housing Act, a landmark predatory lending law, the Essex County Construction Careers Program, the New Jersey Reentry Roundtable that led to the largest percentage decrease in the level of incarceration of any state in the country. There were enormous substantive accomplishments, but more importantly was actually building an organization with a board that was deeply invested, and with all due respect, John, the board's investment wasn't just in the selection, it was actually committing so that its credibility could translate. It was actually also building the credibility so that we were able to grow the organization and have credibility in Newark, in New Jersey, and increasingly nationally. So there you are.
Thank you. So Cornell, to you.
Sure. So first of all, let me begin as Ken did with a word of appreciation. Being back here in Newark after several years and spending quite a bit of time flying about the country, there's no place that feels more like home than Newark, New Jersey. And coming here from suburban Virginia outside of DC by way of South Carolina, not completely understanding jug handles from the turnpike, from the parkway, that was quite a journey for me. And so I'm deeply indebted to the trustees, our staff, and so many people across this state who've supported the work of the Institute for Social Justice. So in terms of challenges that reflect on the character of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. If you can think back to 2007 and 2008, when the economy of this country crashed, where we endured a credit crisis, a foreclosure crisis, an unemployment crisis. And in the midst of that, you have this small nonprofit endeavoring to do social justice in New Jersey. We have people coming through the workforce development program who are looking for opportunity and being met with disappointment. We have a portfolio, well managed, but as I recall driving from Washington, D.C. back up to New Jersey, having my wife call me on the phone and saying, I just heard Lehman Brothers and the Federal Reserve and this crisis in the same sentence. This cannot be good. And by the time I got back to Newark, our manager, portfolio manager, no longer existed. And sitting down with the board, grappling with the prospect of laying off staff, curtailing and constraining work. And I remember standing on Broad Street, and one of our trustees, who shall remain nameless, but who is a physicist, said to me as a brand new CEO, with the economy crashing, the prospect of laying off my new colleagues, well, Cornell, you just have to have faith. Now, a physicist telling a fourth generation ordained minister you have to have faith is an expression of the character of the Institute, namely a willingness to make strategic risk, to take on strategic risk, and express a deep belief in the capacity of the board, of the staff, of our partners. And so in other words, rather than shrink the staff, everyone took a furlough. We took a percentage cut of our salaries. The board did not shrink the staff. We took on more volunteer staff. We took on more work, and our funders got behind it. And so that allowed us to do more work. In terms of risk, when you think about our board members, another board member who shall remain nameless, but who happens to be the chair. When we went to Trenton to lobby for Ban the Box, we had the business community somewhat apprehensive As in, the bill that we were pushing for was the most lobbied bill, as in lobbied against in New Jersey. It passed anyway. Our trustee testified in favor of the bill, and of course we argued that this will have a negligible to no impact on business. It is my deep suspicion that it had some impact on our chair's business as a corporate lawyer. But he engaged and took on the risk. That is an expression of the work of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. In other words, betting on people, betting on communities, and persisting till the end. In terms of what I'm proud of, think about this. 6 bills passed in 4.5 years. Ban the Box was a model for the country, applying to both public and private employers. The prison reentry legislation that was called a model for the country by the New York Times, providing food stamps and general support to people coming out of prison. The foreclosure mitigation and mediation program, and the arc of this work is really an arc that does not represent my tenure. But in other words, Ken's work in terms of the prison reentry roundtables, the workforce development program that allowed us to go to Trenton and to say we represent real people. We have not only produced the papers, we have not only produced the briefs, we've not only done the amicus briefs, we have real people who will benefit from our work. So in other words, we not only had policy cred, analytic cred, but street cred as a consequence of helping people get tattoos removed, as a consequence of people giving people interview clothes to seek jobs. So in other words, the work of the Institute, for me, represents analytic rigor, doing the serious work in terms of figuring out what the policy should be, but being grounded in community. Because at the end of the day, when you seek reform by yourself, frequently the reform is just yours. But after 20 years, we've sought reform and people own it because it belongs to them.
Ryan.
Hey, good evening, folks. Good evening, folks.
Good evening.
Good evening, folks. So I just got to tell you how humbled I am to be on this stage as a third CEO and president of the Institute for Social Justice. I'm humbled that you all have joined us this evening. I've just been thinking about 20 years, and I was brought back to where I was 20 years ago. It's true, I was an intern at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I was actually an intern for Elise. And I'm a kid originally from Denver, Colorado. I learned about the Legal Defense Fund from a social studies class in high school. It's called The Black Experience. And the teacher then showed us these black and white videos in this documentary called Eyes on the Prize. And I learned, right, folks are familiar, I learned about Thurgood Marshall in these videos. And I watched him destroy people, straight up racists, with his mind. And I thought to myself, I wanna do that. And so some years later, when I was a law student, I applied for an internship with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And I fooled enough folks and I got the summer internship. And so I moved across the country from Denver. I had not grown up with my father. I met my father when I was 21. But I met him in college sometime, and I was telling my father I got this internship at the Legal Defense Fund. It's downtown Manhattan. My father at that time was living in Brooklyn. And so he said, hey, son, you can come live with me. This would be a great way for us to connect and begin to build a relationship. I know it's a risky proposition. You're looking at me sideways. But I nevertheless flew across the country. My then girlfriend, high school girlfriend, Charity, was teaching in Newark. So I knew someone at least across the river. And I got to New York City and into Brooklyn on a Friday night. Moved in with my father, I slept on the couch. Friday night, all good. We had pizza. Saturday, we had pizza again. There was basketball, right? Sunday, I got up early. I got dressed, did a practice run to LDF, took the train, walked to the office, timed myself. I was anxious. Monday morning, first day of work, I get dressed. I'm up early, so is my father. My father says, Ryan, I did not appreciate how crowded it would be with you here. I told you it was a risky proposition. And I said, wow, me neither. Father leaves for work. I pack up my things. I get to LDF super early. This is the first day of my internship. I got my suit and tie on, Elise Body. And fortunately, the cleaning lady lets me in I hide my suitcase in the library. And then on my lunch break, I called Charity and I said, hey, Charity, is there some place I can stay in Newark? She said, well, you can't stay with me, but you can stay at the Newark YMCA.
Oh, wow.
I say, bet. I called the Y, I explained, I'm very humbled, ma'am, I'm embarrassed to tell you this, but this is my story, I need a place to stay. She said, well, you could stay here for $8 a day. And I moved in that night. I had to wait. Everybody had to leave because, again, you can't be the dude the first day in the job with a suitcase. So everybody left, and I took the PATH train to Newark. I moved into room 531, and that began my early education in the city of Newark. And so I worked as an intern. At LDF during the day, but at nighttime, we'd have these fascinating conversations around what I was learning and what they were experiencing. So I was learning about structural racism and systems that disadvantage people of color academically, and I was learning how it was actually impacting people at night. And at the end of that summer, Elise said, you know, Ryan, there's a fellowship called the Freed Frank LDF Fellowship. She was the first recipient to get this fellowship. She said, you should really apply for this fellowship. Here's the thing, folks. I'm a kid from Denver. I went to some decent schools. Elise was, again, the first fellow. She went to Harvard more than one time. You know what I mean? So if you just, if you look at Elise's body, it wouldn't make sense that you would then see a Ryan Haygood. But Elise's body was that guardian angel that everybody hopes that they have in life, right? The one who champions you in a way that gets you interviews you really should not have. And before I know it, I had an interview for the Freed Frank LDF Fellowship. And I had a sufficient amount of preparation, thanks to Elise, for each of those fellowships. And again, I fooled enough people that I got the Freed Frank LDF Fellowship. And so I spent 2 years at Freed Frank, and then I spent the next 12 or so years at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund until Cornell Brooks leaves to go to the NAACP. And it turns out that Elise's body was now on the board of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. She said, you know, Ryan, you should apply.
Is this really how you want to use your time?
This is important. We gotta ground ourselves in this, you know, because this keeps us humble, right? So she said, you should apply for Cornell's job. I said, oh gosh, the job that Cornell Brooks had, and before that, Ken Zimmerman, is that? But Elise's body was on the board. So I fooled enough people, and I got this job, and I've been here for now 3.5 years. And I want to say really quickly, a challenge and a strength. So one of the challenges I faced when I came to the Institute was that it was an organization that had this very interesting blend of direct services and policy advocacy. There are very few organizations that do both. And I saw Ken's vision for it. It was to do direct services, particularly for folks coming home from a period of incarceration, and that could then inform a policy strategy so that Ken's work on direct services led to Cornell's work in Ban the Box. Direct services led to a policy change. When I entered the frame after the difficult period that Cornell described, it was very difficult to fundraise for the direct services program. And when I say very difficult, some of my colleagues who were there at the time could tell you, very difficult means very, very difficult, meaning we could no longer fundraise in a way that could sustain the program. And so at the end of my very first year at the organization, I worked with the board to make one of the most difficult professional decisions I had ever made, which was to wind down the direct services component of our work and begin to become a straight legal advocacy organization, to John's point, whose mission really is to identify structural load-bearing walls of inequality that if we topple them will open up opportunity for people of color in our urban centers. And so I just want to say very quickly what that has looked like concretely. So we did a lot of work in the pre-apprenticeship space. In my time, we've really, to Cornell's point, dug very deeply in communities to do community organizing. We then do our own independent research and writing. We take both what we've heard directly from folks in communities and our own research and writing to advocate. So very recently, one of my colleagues who leads our economic justice work, Demel Zubair, authored a report around apprenticeships. And she created this report looking at apprenticeships from a sort of racial and gender justice lens, looking at them out both inside the construction trades industry, but also in a number of other industries. And in this report, there are 10 recommendations, policy recommendations. So we took this report, We gave it to a senator, Teresa Ruiz, and she introduced all 10 of those recommendations as legislation. And 5 of them have already cleared the Senate. And we think that all 10 will move and be signed by the governor in May. And so part of what we have been thinking about is how do we work, yes, deeply in communities to organize folks around a policy agenda? How do we do our own research and writing that sets forth policy recommendations? How do we get legislators to introduce it? And how do we put pressure on folks to really implement it? And so I think that is part of what our model has looked like in each of our pillar areas. And the final thing I'll say is what I think we have done well. So here I'm really humbled to say, I think one of my strengths as a leader of the Institute is I've just been able to hire a fantastic team. We really do have national level talent. We are a majority women, mostly majority people of color, women, people of color organization, and that's the strength. So I just hire fantastic people, and then I just get out of the way, and they do their work. And I just want to ask them to stand up and be recognized.
Well, thank you all. And since I just want to say, so Ryan's been a transformational leader. When he tells that story, he makes it sound like, I sort of ginned up the process and Ryan got kind of fitted in. No, that's not the way it happened. Ryan has been an amazing, I just wanted to be clear, and I think it's probably clear to all of you in the room, which is why you're here. The Institute has really done amazing things under his leadership. So I'm going to pivot, actually, building on that point. So we're clearly in a moment of turbulence, let's just say, on the national stage, right? Maybe that's, a euphemistic way of putting it, right? Lots of turmoil across the country. And so this is a question about sort of the challenges of change in this time and the possibilities for change. And here we have an organization that is embedded in New Jersey, but has an increasingly national profile. And so how do you make a decision as the former and current CEOs of the organization about how to create change, right? What are and Ken, you've talked a little bit already about the theory of change, but how do you decide when is it that moment to swing for the hills and do big picture, big ideas, transformational change? When do you decide we're going to work more incrementally to sort of, we have a goal that's far into the future, but we're going to work constructively to get to that goal? How do you make those decisions? What are some of the strategies that you think the Institute should employ, is employing now? And how do we navigate? How should the Institute navigate these very challenging times, but also times that are rich with possibility?
And again, we'll go this order, I assume.
We'll go start with you.
So first, I just want to start off by saying, everybody recognized Elise was an intern of mine at one point, so I just want to get credit here for everything that evidently flowed from Elise's accomplishments. I'm just taking that here. So let me, dig into it by saying I think there's a need to both be ambitious and humble simultaneously. Change doesn't occur from any single organization, so when I think about what swinging to the fences means, going back to vision without a plan is just hallucination, I think it is what's the form of leadership you're really going to embark on. And I think for a state-level organization like the Institute, it's a particularly important moment because as we're increasingly seeing, the national challenges that exist are increasingly clear: inequality, racial injustice, the diminishment of a collective sense of the aspirations of this country. But to solve that requires deep local knowledge, credibility, and sophistication. So it's fascinating to me to think about I've actually been in conversation recently with Stacey Abrams, who most folks have heard of, as she's creating a nonprofit in Georgia at this moment. And frankly, I'm using the Institute as a model of what a nonprofit can be that's deeply rooted in a place, because we know national challenges and national ideas only gain traction when there's entities that are capable, sophisticated, and devoted, not just in the moment, but over time. One of the significance of the 20th anniversary means that it's an entity that, unlike many, unfortunately, that pivot and that leave, is here and has a credibility as a result that I think is significant. But I'd also go a step further and say that, on some level, I almost disagree with the premise, because one of the things that I hope for the Institute is that it continues to evolve in what are the right strategies it can pursue. I mean, the only thing I would correct in what Ryan said is that ECCC I loved, I thought it was a great success, but it was never intended to be a permanent part of the organization. In fact, it was started as a demonstration project with an idea to see if we could prove its success, and we did, and the state invested up to $30 million, as Rodney will remember, to have it replicated elsewhere. And part of the sign of a mature organization is when it acknowledges that it has done what it can and then translate. And I think if I had an ambition for the Institute, there's a deep need for a kind of state-rooted organization to be able to see what are the new modes of change that need to occur. I mean, I'm fascinated, an organization that I got familiar with that deals with the Muslim community created an app so that people going through an airport can immediately file a complaint with the FAA. Okay, there's a fantastic organization that works with domestic workers that's using tech platforms to create certifications to improve the wages and working conditions of domestic workers, an entirely different kind of approach. The experimentation in terms of what leads to addressing the kinds of structural roots of inequality requires increasing nimbleness and adaptation. And to me, that's a really significant piece of what an organization like the Institute can be. Last point, I also think it's about talent. I could not agree with Ryan more in terms of my own experience was made possible by the remarkable people that we had. And frankly, you know, I look at Rodney, who was telling me that was the initial director of the ECCC program, went on to become, you know, the head of workforce development in Newark and then in Philadelphia. And the investment in people, regardless of whether they stay with the Institute, and sometimes especially when they leave the Institute and move forward. I mean, the wonderful fellowship that John made possible to have Johannes is about an investment in the talent that is going to make change. And when I think about what the Institute can be, that is swinging for the fences because it's about a belief in people and their ability to actually further transformation.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I won't even, I won't even, you mentioned, you know, you emphasized that I was your intern. I won't tell the full story of how you duped me into a pickup basketball game that didn't go so well for me, so I'll just leave it there. But Ken knows what I'm talking about. Cornell, on that happy note?
Sure. I don't think I interned for anyone here on stage.
Even though we were colleagues.
That's right. We were colleagues at the Department of Justice.
That's right. Yeah. Oh, and at Cornell in the Justice, yeah, too.
So when I think about the Institute on the national landscape of social justice, I think it's important to appreciate the distinctiveness of the Institute, the uniqueness of the Institute. What I mean by that is an organization where you are, and when I say you, communities, staff, trustees, partners, have the opportunity to engage in thoughtful risk-taking in terms of policymaking. That, of course, is related to moral ambition, which is to say that you can really endeavor to swing for the fences while looking for strategic opportunities for incremental change. These two go together. They're not polarities. They're not a dichotomy in terms of, you know, morally ambitious goals and a kind of creeping incrementalism. One of the things that I think is particularly distinctive about the Institute is that we've managed to do both relatively well, as we've managed to succeed on occasion, but also to fail efficiently. Right? In other words, understanding that, for example, with Ban the Box, we, the first time we brought that out of the gate, the business community stripped it out of the prison reentry legislation. So at a point in time where The New York Times was patting us on the back. In the middle of a recession, we knew the thing that people most wanted, we did not get. And one of our trustees, Al Copy, said, look, you didn't get that because you did not sufficiently engage the business community, which gets me to the next point. With respect to what the Institute can offer the country is both means and ends. And with respect to means, being able to be very thoughtful about what's working, what's not working, and being able to stop what's not working. So with respect to advocating for criminal justice reform, in the case of Ban the Box, we engaged the CEOs of some of the largest companies for the better part of a year behind closed doors. Right? So while we had the Second Chance campaign going, we, through the Newark Alliance, engaged these CEOs, having tough conversations about negligent hiring, having tough conversations about the churn rate of employees. What happens to those who are caught between the vice grip of criminal background checks and credit checks? It's important, I think, for this means to be replicated. That is to say, earlier this afternoon, I conducted one of my classes at Harvard Kennedy School from the offices of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. And one of my students asked, when the Institute builds a coalition, who do you leave out? And our community organizers, who happen to be their guest lecturers for the day, they said nobody. Because the Institute is very, very thoughtful about building broad coalitions. So if you can think about organizing the clergy, Jewish Federation, the Pentecostals, the Baptists, the Episcopalians, one part of the coalition. The CEOs of the largest companies, another part of the coalition. Work with the state chambers of commerce. 20 to 30 organizations through the Second Chance campaign. Law enforcement. Being very thoughtful about how we engage and craft and create coalitions. That's a lesson for the country, because the fact of the matter is, at the federal level, we've seen nothing but paralysis, with the exception of the First Step Act in terms of criminal justice reform. So one of the things I think we have to seriously think about is not merely trying to teach the country what to do with respect to ends. In other words, what policy goals should we seek, but rather also thinking about how we should seek them. How do we build coalitions? How do we create credibility? So for example, when the Jet Foundation gave the Institute research funding to produce a paper on gangs and reentry, we produced the paper, had some money left over, we then go to the Jet Foundation and said, can we take this funding, leftover funding, and produce a film replicating the research? So we put the scholars on film, but also members of Bloods, Crip, Latin Kings on film, along with Senator Booker. The point being here is being entrepreneurial and experimental with respect to the means. Now, in terms of specific policy goals, we have a rare opportunity in terms of criminal justice reform. We're beginning to see an unthawing, if you will. So in terms of there's much to be done with bail reform, with New Jersey having led the way. Think about this. We had the largest drop in the incarceration rate within the state of New Jersey, the direct result of the advocacy of the Institute and many other organizations. Very significant. When we think about what happened in terms of reduction of the incarceration rate with respect to children, this builds on Ken's work and certainly on Ryan's work. In terms of youth court, in terms of JDAI, that's nationally standard-setting work. Criminal justice reform, I believe, is a major area where the Institute can lead and create opportunities for other policy reforms. In other words, we use this as the tip of the spear to talk about civic engagement, voter disenfranchisement, the campaign that you have engaged in thus far in terms of restoring the right to vote to people under the custody of the criminal justice system, I think key. Lastly, being aware of the power of symbolism. So in other words, it's not just securing the policy goals, but it's also saying to the country, you can do it in a way that includes nearly everyone. That's important, because as long as you get what you get by yourself, you only get it for yourself and you're not likely to keep it.
That's it. Yes, thank you. So Ryan, I'm going to cede the podium to you to talk about the future for the Institute and your priorities and policy goals, and then you can weave in your responses to the other question.
Sure.
And then close us out.
Sure. So, I was thinking a lot about Cornell's focus on the criminal justice context and, in light of this particularly difficult national moment, right? It's very hard to understate how difficult Washington, D.C. is right now, right? How difficult Washington, D.C. is right now. But I think to Alicia's point, that presents for us a pretty special opportunity on the state level, because we know that when change has happened, it's always happened from the ground up in our community. And yes, sometimes it's been assisted by national support, but it's always started in our communities from the ground up. And so I just want to say a quick word about what that advocacy has looked like for us from the ground up in the criminal justice context. So my colleague, Andrea McChristian, who leads our criminal justice work, authored a report that looked at the youth incarceration phenomenon in New Jersey. And the Institute for many, many years under Doug's leadership and Jerry's leadership did a lot of powerful work in the youth justice advocacy space, bringing about legislation that would make the conditions of confinement for young people better. And I enter a space where Andrea writes this report, and what she finds is that New Jersey has the highest black to white youth incarceration disparity rate in America. So in New Jersey, the black to white youth incarceration disparity rate is 30-1, which means a black kid in New Jersey is 30 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white kid, even though, as her research shows, black and white kids commit most offenses at about the same rate. So we have this incredible challenge with racial disparities. The next state is Wisconsin. Wisconsin incarcerates black kids at a rate of 15-1, but New Jersey is 30-1. And so there are these staggering racial disparities, but we also learned that New Jersey spends an extraordinary amount of money incarcerating kids. So New Jersey spends about $280,000 each year to incarcerate each kid. And I think about the educators like my wife in the room, and imagine, if you will, what you could do in a kid's life were you to invest $280,000. And the final thing is that though our system is characterized by shameful racial disparities, though we invest a lot in the system, the yield is very low. So Andrea's research showed that within 3 years, 70% of kids were either rearrested or returned to these failed youth prisons. And so we really, drawing upon our experience with youth justice advocacy, begin to think very boldly, well, how can you transform a system that's entirely broken? And we ultimately concluded that, well, there are some systems for which you really can't tinker around the edges, and you just got to end them entirely. And so we began to think very carefully about Jamesburg. Jamesburg is New Jersey's largest youth prison for boys. It opened 150 years ago. It opens 2 years after the end of the Civil War. Civil War ends in 1865. In 1867, New Jersey opens Jamesburg. And over the last 152 years, thousands of kids have come through Jamesburg's gates and left no better. And so we started thinking about, well, how do you change a shameful system like this where you ultimately end it? So we began, my colleague Retha Onatiri, who leads our community organizing work, and a team of us began to fan out across New Jersey and dig very, very deeply into communities and to have hard conversations around what New Jersey does with respect to its black and brown kids when they find themselves in a difficult spot. And how do you contrast that against the way this plays out in communities ravaged by the opioid crisis, right? So we know that often this most recent phenomenon, we know that 90% of new opioid users in the last 10 years have been white. And the response to those ensnared in the opioid epidemic has been very different than the one we saw 20, 30 years ago with respect to those addicted to crack cocaine. And even today, that informs how we respond to black and brown kids in the system. So we launched a campaign called 150 Years is Enough. And we did it outside of Jamesburg Youth Prison. We spent a bunch of time pushing really hard on the past governor, Governor Christie, and his attorney general, who actually began to really develop a heart for this issue. Chris Perino is his name. And we launched a campaign on the 150th anniversary year of Jamesburg. We were joined by hundreds of people. It's very difficult, as it turns out, to get to Jamesburg. It's not close, right? So the parents who have kids there don't see their kids. And so it's very difficult to get there, but we were nevertheless joined by hundreds of people who were unified around the idea that 150 years of failed youth incarceration is enough. And right before Chris Christie left office, he announced the closure of Jamesburg Youth Prison for Boys, and he announced the closure of another youth prison. This is Hayes, which is New Jersey's only youth prison for girls. And I just want to say a quick word about Hayes, because Andrea's research also taught us that Hayes is the site of what was called the Bordentown School for Colored Youth. So for about 70 years, New Jersey ran a publicly run elite boarding school for black youth. It attracted luminaries who taught there like Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington. It was called the Tuskegee of the North because it was modeled after Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And New Jersey ran this school until the Brown decision in 1954. The school closes in 1955, and today, what was a site of elite black learning, the Bordentown School for Colored Youth, is today a prison for girls. And across the street is New Jersey's third youth prison, the Juvenile Medium Secure Facility. So that this ground is literally the school-to-prison pipeline realized. And so to John's point about building load-bearing walls, what we've been seeking to do through this campaign is to close youth prisons, to begin to invest those resources back into communities on the front end most impacted by mass incarceration, and to begin to build those institutions that used to serve our kids and should do so again. So I offer that model because, again, in this difficult national moment, people are not wanting to be spectators. Like you all came tonight, you all are advocates. And so what we've been able to do through our advocacy is to engage people to say, look, we are actually, notwithstanding how difficult the national moment is, we are empowered in our local spaces where we have spheres of influence. And so I've seen many of you joined us outside of Jamesburg. You joined the campaign now to urge Governor Murphy to make real the transformation that is possible in this moment. And part of that advocacy led to Governor Murphy convening a youth justice task force to begin to bring about that transformation. So I just want to say a quick word about the final piece of the Institute's work. I talked about the economic justice piece that's led by Demelza. We recently learned through Prosperity Now, their most recent data shows that New Jersey, as folks know, is one of the wealthiest states in America. The median net worth last year for New Jersey's white families, as Demelza will tell you, was $271,000, the highest in America, right? But by contrast, the median net worth for New Jersey's Latino and black families was $7,200 and $5,900. Well, Prosperity Now recently released its most recent data, and it reflects that the median net worth for New Jersey's white families has actually increased even more to $309,000 a year. Still the highest in America, while the median net worth for black families is still at $5,900. So how do we build systems that create wealth in communities that have been deprived of it? In the criminal justice reform space, how do we, under Andrea's leadership, begin to destroy these load-bearing walls of structural inequality and build those that serve us? And finally, as Cornell mentioned, I just want to say very briefly, because New Jersey connects voting to its criminal justice system, which has all these racial disparities, New Jersey literally inserts inequality from the criminal justice system into the political process. So that today about 100,000 people cannot vote because they have a criminal conviction. 50% of them are black. The black folks make up just 15% of the overall population. And this was a law that New Jersey passed in 1844, which was the same year that it restricted voting to white men only. So we've launched a campaign with the same folks engaged in our other aspects of work called 1844 No More. And we worked with some courageous legislators who introduced legislation that would make New Jersey like Maine and Vermont and most Western democracies, and would enfranchise 100,000 people in prison, on probation, and parole. And I encourage you, yes. We have, as I close, we have the ability with our advocacy in this room and outside of it to empower those 100,000 people to vote in this November election if we organize and push our elected officials. Every seat is up in the New Jersey Assembly. My colleague Hennel will tell you, and Ron will tell you, there are 80 seats that are up. And they are very, very mindful of this November election. And the onus is really on us to move them to action to ensure that these folks can vote as they should have been able to vote many, many years ago in this upcoming election. So so I do want to close by thanking you all for joining us tonight. Please give a hand for Ken Zimmerman. Please give a hand to Cornell Brooks. And please give a hand to the mighty board of the trustees of the Institute and the staff. And finally, please give a hand to yourself for joining us tonight. So I just, Alan Lowenstein wrote this book, his book, his autobiography 20 years ago in 1999. And he said this toward the end. He said, at this writing, the Institute is just getting underway. Its value to the state and its impact on the social needs of New Jersey are yet to be determined. Hopefully, the Institute will be my final significant contribution to the welfare of New Jersey. And I'm thankful that we get to be a part of his legacy, get to be a part of doing what he described as the highest goal of humanity, which is to do social justice. And I'm thankful that you all have joined us to celebrate these 20 years and many, many more. So thank you so much. And the final piece, as Gail is telling me, is we have our anniversary gala June 13th. It's at NJISJ, which, folks, was a magnificent, world-class Performing Arts Center. Doug Eakley has the flyer. I urge you to join us in this 20th anniversary gala. We've got a great lineup of guests. Thank you so much. You want to close us out in a word of prayer?
Oh my gosh.
We can't resist it.
I can't.
We can't resist it.
All right, listen, I'm going to ask that we extend our hands to our left and our right. And whatever tradition that you are part of, you will be a part of this prayer. And whether you're in a tradition or not, hopefully you feel held by those who are holding your hands. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Dear Lord, we just give you thanks for all those who are assembled here. Beneath your care, beneath your eyesight, and in your care and within your hands. We ask that you strengthen our hands, strengthen our hearts, strengthen our minds, so that we lift up the work that you have before us, that we pursue social justice, that we make a difference in New Jersey, in Newark, and in the lives of the people whom you call your children. Thank you for the 20 years that have passed, the 20 years in the future, and the great work ahead. Let those who so believe say amen. Amen. And amen. Amen. Hey, my friend.
That's done.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you.